All right, welcome to this, again, narrated presentation, summarizing the highlights from Chapter 7 using the PowerPoint as developed by the publishers. You know what I would say about supplementing versus reading the chapter, so that's actually all I'm going to say about that. So welcome back. This is actually a little bit of a briefer PowerPoint, probably helpful for you to know that up front, and that the material in this chapter really takes a look at what I call, or what they call, the behavior dependence, and what I am going to call a little bit some of the appearance of dependence, i.e., so how does it affect both the individual, him or herself, as they progress from use to misuse to substance use disorders, but also how that appearance is perceived by people outside of them. And so this really supplements some of the work that was discussed in Chapter 4, actually, which talked a little bit more about diagnosis, diagnostic criteria, things like that. So when they start the chapter, they talk actually about this outline of the person in terms of how his or her behavior changes. And so we're going to start by taking a look at that. But once we've taken a look at how their behavior changes, then we're going to look at sort of the evolution of that process. In Chapter 4, we talked about the concept of progression. We looked at the work of Jelnick and his description of the phases of alcohol use disorder or alcohol dependence. Also then talked about Valiant's work as a follow-up to try to either confirm or disconfirm some of that work, introduce the idea of the progressive nature of alcohol use disorder and other substance use disorders. And so we will take a look at how the behavior changes over time. We're going to look at how things get worse, deteriorating functioning, how it impacts really the constellation of their life, i.e. family, friends, social relationships, work, for adolescents, school, those sorts of things. Some quick comments about generalization to other drugs of abuse, and then really closing with also a comparison actually of adolescents, some quick comments about how this applies to and some potential changes on adolescent sort of progression. And then they conclude the chapter with kind of a final comment or a final thought on the whole concept that these changes as they occur, because they occur over time, are oftentimes going to be more or less visible both to the substance-involved person, him or herself, as well as to the family around them. And so they may be observable to clinicians, to family members, to what I call or what they call the outside world. They aren't always observable to the individual who's going through these changes, him or herself. So we'll make some comments about that, or the author actually has made some comments about that as she closed the chapter here. Looking first at the behavioral composite of an alcoholic, and this was summarized in that first really couple of sections of this chapter. Really what you're going to see here are the kinds of things that are observable, that are happening for the alcoholic individual as their drinking progresses over time, and this is how they're perceived by the outside world as well. It becomes very, very unpredictable. Moods and behavior are volatile and unpredictable, and really rapid and really unpredictable. And so people learn to begin to expect unpredictability. Many folks will talk about how it's like walking on eggshells because depending on where the person's at in terms of his or her use of alcohol, they can be very, very different people. They also talk about how the changes are evident with this unpredictable or inconsistent ability to be responsible, i.e. alternating between the ability to do what they need to do and the complete lack of that ability or complete irresponsibility. Over time, too, as the drinking progresses, obviously there continues to be, or there develops a stronger and stronger urge or compulsion to continue to drink or to continue to use other drugs. Behaviorally, other responsibilities in the person's life begin to be compromised. People forget to do the things that they're supposed to do. They don't keep commitments. They promise many, many things, but they don't follow through their promises. They fail to show up when they're supposed to show up. And so we're just seeing a lot of changes, and these are oftentimes in people who are as responsible and as predictable as people who are not having substance use problems are experiencing. And as you see the last bullet point here, and so really characterized by a variety of things that are always present to greater and lesser degrees. It's confusing. There's anger, there's frustration, there's depression, there's withdrawal, there's resentments. There's many, many things that are occurring all, and they begin to become more and more prominent and more overwhelming as the drinking progresses. These changes occur over time, so they don't occur overnight, and so that's one of the challenges about looking at these behavioral changes is that they occur over time. They don't change overnight, in a 24-hour period, and so they can be really gradual, and people become accustomed, and so they gradually begin to forget that the person used to behave a certain way, because over time the behavior has changed. They're also hard. Because they're unpredictable, there are times where the person appears to be really having a lot of problems, what they call here disturbed behavior, so behaviors that are really noticeable to people around them, and then alternating with when they appear to be fairly, quote, normal. They're fine, they're predictable, they're comfortable, they're behaving in all the ways that people expect, and behaving in ways that are not problematic. And so it's this back and forth, unpredictable, really unusual, quote, extreme or disturbed behaviors, interspersed with times where they appear to be normal, and kind of the evaluating that the people around them are doing that. Wait a minute, who am I seeing today? Is it going to be Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde? Who is it that's going to be showing up here? As you can guess, it becomes more and more challenging because this unpredictability, these behavior changes, these disturbances, all ultimately are things that are going to impact the person's life, i.e. personal relationships and social relationships and work relationships and potentially legal and things like that. So the changes will ripple out over time. And while there's a certain level of unawareness or ignorance of the changes, ultimately, as the person drinking or using begins to identify and recognize that there are some things that are not, quote, normal for them, they start to feel the stigma. They start to feel embarrassed. They start to feel guilty. They become ashamed of themselves. And so it becomes a sort of a negative cycle where the person becomes more and more aware of how he or she is changing. But the compulsion to continue to drink, for example, overrides the awareness of this guilt and shame. So the person will continue to use their drug of choice, and then also continue to experience more and more guilt and shame, recognizing that there are some things that they are not doing that they should be doing, recognizing on certain days, certain times, that there's problems that they are experiencing that might be related to their alcohol use. But it is really hard to give up the use of the substance because the compulsion and the biological changes have made it more and more important for the person to continue to be under the influence. They spend quite a bit of time in the chapter looking at the work of Vernon Johnson, the author of a book called I'll Quit Tomorrow. And in some respects, it's somewhat similar to the work of Jellinek, i.e. it's an attempt to describe the changes that occur over time in relationship to the person's use, in his case, of alcohol, but it can be applied and has been applied to the use of all mood-altering substances. Again, the progression from use to social use to misuse to a problematic use. And so we're going to take a look at this here. Johnson's perspective was that anyone who uses a substance is going to always go through the first two stages in his model. It's only people who experience substance use disorders, alcohol use disorders, will progress through the second two stages of his model. And it's a pretty simple four-step model. He's going to talk about the first step. Person doesn't know what's going to happen when they use the substance, and so they're learning what's going to happen. They're learning, quote, how their mood is going to change, and he calls it learning the mood swing. The use of alcohol is an unknown. There's some expectations around this. The person uses alcohol the first time. They experience the use as positive. They experience a change in mood as being, pleasure, euphoria, etc. And so it's a good thing. They experience it as a good thing. So they're learning that when I drink, I feel better. And so there's rewards, there's reinforcement for using and then continuing to use the substance over time. If you take a look at this here, you have to look at the starting point. It's important, and you're going to see a video from Dr. Volkow in this module that talks about what I call normal, i.e. that we have a normal range, we have a homeostasis, which is a biologic term, but we tend to be normal. We tend to live our life normal, and we tend to have a range. There's some days where we feel good. The most extreme pleasure is euphoria over here at the high end, and some days we don't feel well, and that can be pain, that can be distress. Ideally, it's not always at the low end, but we alternate. In general, we're in the middle and normal, but we alternate between experiencing somewhere along the line pleasure or euphoria, and also on certain days, certain times, pain. Learning the mood swing, person starts from normal, as you can see here. When they drink, they experience some reinforcement, some pleasure. It isn't necessarily total euphoria, but it's a pleasurable experience. So they drink, it moves them to a pleasurable way. Over time, drinking and the effects of drinking wear off, and the person returns back to normal. That's how Johnson conceptualized the learning the mood swing. The next stage really is just a continuation of that. And this is pretty consistent with a learning model where the person is no longer learning the mood swing. They know what's going to happen. And so they've also experienced and labeled that effect as being pleasurable. And so it's not learning the mood swing, it's seeking the mood swing. They drink, or we drink, because we know when we drink we're going to feel better. And so therefore I'm seeking that pleasurable effect of using the substance. The other things that happen here is that the person begins to experience on some level the link between using alcohol and changing the mood. So they talk about dependence on alcohol is increased. This isn't, quote, substance use dependence here. This is simply the person saying, okay, I will use alcohol in order to feel better. The other thing that people begin to do here is recognize that if they increase the dosage, and they talk here about degrees is increased by altering the dosage. If we increase the dosage, we increase the mood swing. If we decrease the dosage, we decrease the mood swing. And so there's a link between mood change and alteration in the dosage. And there also begin to be some problems. So there are, quote, occasional negative drinking experiences, but the person justifies, rationalizes these. They're not typically extreme problematic experiences. Most common one is a person may experience a hangover. And so not a pleasurable experience. The person recognizes it's a consequence of consuming too much alcohol. However, they're willing to accept that consequence as continue to use their substance. So what we start to see here, though, is that instead of starting from the normal position over time, as a person continues to use alcohol, and we'll talk specific about alcohol, they're now starting from this slightly less than normal position. When they drink, it moves them up towards the pleasurable range, and so the person starts to feel better. And when the person returns from or they finish metabolizing the alcohol, they're back to a normal stage. And so you're going to see a slight shift towards what I call this painful end of the spectrum here, starting with some not significant pain, but feeling a little bit down, a little bit uncomfortable, and wanting to use alcohol. I am seeking the mood swing to help me feel better, and when I come down from, or when the alcohol is completely out of my system, I'm back in, quote, my normal, the homeostasis condition. Remember, stages 1 and 2 are what Johnson conceptualizes as all drinkers going through, but stages 3 and 4 are for individuals who are going to continue to use and to move beyond learning and seeking to now beginning to use alcohol in harmful ways. We're going to look at the shift about how alcohol is now having what they're calling here a boomerang effect, but when I'm not under the influence, I'm going to be on the pain end, and we'll look at that at the next slide. The person now also becomes aware of the negative consequences, so there is growing awareness that when my drinking is in fact causing me some problems. However, as a part of that, they also recognize that if I continue to drink in the same way, I'm going to start to have some costs. They talk about emotional costs, which are the most common costs, but recognizing that there are changes that are occurring in social relationships. There's some changes that are occurring emotionally. However, the person begins to prioritize their use of alcohol or other drugs over other relationships. And so emotionally now, drinkers are beginning to identify that the most important thing that I'm doing right now is this relationship with my, quote, substance of choice, my drug of choice, which is a term that you're going to become familiar with. Continuing actually on discussion of stage 3, the harmful use stage. So this is also where people begin to protect their choices and their decisions to continue to use their drug of choice. And so we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the rationalization and denial that goes on, the defense mechanisms. If I am prioritizing my use of a substance, part of what I need to do in order to prioritize that is to be able to defend my continued use of that substance, because other individuals around me, whether it be family members, loved ones, relationships, friends, employers, etc., are all now beginning to potentially question me or point out the challenges or the problems that my substance use is causing. And in order for me to continue to use, I have to be able to defend, to rationalize, to project, to maintain my substances so that I can continue to use and sort of fight off the attacks that are being made on my continued use of a substance. In order to do that, part of what I have to do is maintain my perception that alcohol is always a good thing. I have to be able to not see it as a problematic thing. And we're also going to see an extension here that, but prolonged alcohol use now begins to diminish the sense, or the regular sense of well-being. So as we look here, there was that boomerang effect, and so when I'm not drinking, I'm not feeling normal. I'm starting to feel uncomfortable. So I'm beginning to shift down towards this painful end of it. I do know, I've learned that when I drink, I'm going to move up to this, this towards euphoria, towards pleasure, becomes pleasurable. But what happens as the body, in particular the brain, adapts, when the alcohol wears off, I now am at the point where I'm feeling uncomfortable. I'm feeling distress. And as you can guess, what happens over time is I begin to I want to relieve that distress, and so I continue to use the substance. It moves me up towards euphoria. It comes off, or I come down over time. I start to, back at the point of feeling distressful, and so in order to maintain myself in normal or better than normal position, I begin to continue to use on a more regular basis. So I'm now using in a harmful manner. And again, for people who progress to the stage of having what's going to be diagnosed as a severe alcohol use disorder, I now progress to the stage 4, where and we'll look at this at the next slide, but I now am drinking or using in order to feel normal. When I'm not under the influence, I'm feeling some level of discomfort, distress. It may be more physical, I might be in withdrawal, it may be more emotional or psychological, but I'm in distress. I don't feel good when I'm not under the influence. I don't feel normal when I'm not under the influence. And so I now have to use to help myself feel normal. I also have to use because my body has adapted, and I need to ward off the symptoms of withdrawal. And so the person now enters what's known as state-dependent drinking. State-dependent learning, which is that it was Johnson's perception that when we learn certain facts under the influence of a substance, in this case under the influence of alcohol, in order to recall those memories or to recall that learning, I have to again be under the influence of alcohol, that it's a state-dependent learning process. And when I'm not drinking or not under the influence of alcohol, I cannot recall, I cannot remember those memories. People around me begin to experience this as distortion. Memory distortions become common because there's things that I don't recall, that I can't remember, in part because of this impact on state-dependent learning. And so people around me begin to perceive and recognize that there's challenges here, that I'm not remembering things properly, and so the distortions now have become common. Looking back at the diagram of stage 4 drinking to feel normal, again, you'll see that I've now shifted. When I first started drinking, when I was learning, I started normal, I went this way. Now what's happening is when I'm not drinking, I don't feel normal. I feel some level of pain or some level of distress. And I have to drink, and the drinking is no longer moving me all the way up to euphoria, no longer being experienced even as pleasurable. What it's doing is it's moving me up to this normal stage, as you see here. And then if I withdraw, if the alcohol is completely eliminated from my system, I have moved down to this painful end, to this stressing end. And as was said earlier, however, what substance users learn is that the minute I start to progress down toward this painful end, if I repeat my use, I interrupt going towards pain and begin to move myself back towards normal. So now my lifestyle is such that I have to use to feel normal, and this is where we see chronic, pervasive, regular use, recurrent use. This is where we see people doing things like changing, revolving patterns of use. If they initially started drinking beer, for example, they'll switch to drinking distilled liquor just because it takes less of there's a higher concentration in distilled liquor. So lots of things here that all are done to help maintain my experience of normal or homeostasis. These really are just an extension or continuation of some of the comments that were made earlier, i.e., so how has this impacted the individual with an alcohol use disorder, severe alcohol use disorder? It's in all the ways that you are probably familiar with. They are unpredictable, they're inconsistent, and things get worse over time. This is kind of consistent with that whole progression idea that as I've continued to drink or continue to use, I continue to experience more and more problems in my life. There are people who can be functional for some time. Over time, they'll also experience this degradation of performance. They become unpredictable, unreliable, inconsistent. Again, we've talked about the extreme mood swings, moody, irritable, difficulty with relationships because of that, an awareness that things are on edge, and so there is a fear of loss of what's going to happen as a result of the continued use, although there's a compulsion to continue to use, as has been discussed. Certainly, individuals that they're involved with interpersonal relationships will suffer as their alcohol consumption continues, and there's problems. There's increased tension levels, especially with individuals who are not like them. If there's people who are active partners in substance use relationships with each other, then some of these things won't happen because they'll both be perceiving the substance use as pleasurable, and while they will be unpredictable and in some respects an unhealthy relationship, the challenges, the interpersonal relationship challenges, become more pronounced when there's a using individual in a relationship with a non-using or a non-problematic using individual. And this really just take a look at this. This is how the first slide, or the previous slide, was talking about how the substance user, him or herself, experiences it. This is how it looks to the outside world, in particular to his or her family. Families go through predictable stages and responses, and they tend to distance themselves from the person. They tend to try to do some things to fix the relationship, but they also tend to, over time, distance themselves as they recognize their inability to do those things. I've talked in other classes and perhaps here about they become hopeless, and so one of the jobs of clinicians, both for people who are actively using and for family members, is to help people move from feeling hopeless, loss of hope for improvement, to feeling hopeful. And that's challenging because from a systems perspective, from a family perspective, the alcoholic or the substance user, his or her use impacts not just them, but the family themselves. As part of their attempt to resolve the issue, families will do some things which they perceive to be things that will help interrupt the process. We use a term in treatment called enabling, which is actually behaviors that are intended to help the substance user, the active substance user, that allow him or her to continue their use. And so the most common example of that is that if I'm experiencing an alcohol use problem and I have a drinking binge weekend, and Monday morning I'm hungover, unable to go to work, I may have my partner or my spouse call in for me, and they do so. And they do that because they don't want me to lose my job. The challenge is that from a substance use perspective, they've enabled my behavior. I'm no longer accountable for my behavior. And ideally, you can think of other examples of that as well. But so, as you think about the concept of enabling, it's a common response from the family and something that you want to be mindful of when you work with families, because people do things that make sense to them. And so people do things because they believe they're going to make things better. And so if what they're doing won't make it better, then clinicians have a responsibility to help them identify other behaviors or other responses that would make things better, that won't allow things to continue. Certainly the last couple of bullets down here talk about the relationship, the quote romantic relationship between partners, between two individuals, and there's biologic impact on sexual functioning. We looked at that really in both chapters 4 and chapter 6. But there's also obviously emotional impacts on sexual relationships, sexual functioning as well. And so that's clearly affected in an adverse or in a negative way. In addition to their increasing problematic use affecting close family relationships and spouse and partner relationship, you'll see similar distancing that's beginning to occur outside of the family as well. And in particular, part of what happens, if you look at the fourth bullet here, and actually the fifth one too a little bit, is that over time, people who are experiencing increasing problems with their alcohol consumption or their substance use begin to move away or distance themselves from people who are not like them. And so if I'm drinking on a regular basis, I will ultimately choose to either hang with people who are drinking with me, or if I don't have any of those folks, I'll just choose to drink over hanging with friends. And so you see some of the evolution that occurs here over time as the alcohol use progresses, from the point, again, of use and experimental use and misuse and problematic use and things like that. And there's these discussions, by the way, occur towards middle to the end of the chapter, pages 201, 202, 203, etc. So again, make sure you take a look at this in the chapter. As you can guess, too, the ripple effects will continue to ripple out, and so close family, partners, spouses, etc., children are affected first, and then friends, closer friends first, more distant friends second, and one of the last areas typically to be affected is the person's work status or person's work situation for a variety of reasons. So it's oftentimes one of the last arenas to be affected. People tend to try to maintain work. People tend to try to keep it hidden from work and are sometimes more successful at doing that. So it's usually the last arena to be affected. There also is some discussion in the chapter, though, is that interestingly enough, the workplace can be one of the what I call triggers or levers that can help people get into treatment. Many companies will have either employee assistance or unions have member assistance programs. Workplaces ideally, hopefully, have an investment in their employees, and so the employer can actually help both motivate, trigger, refer to treatment. It doesn't have to be a negative situation. It can be, and so I don't want to pretend that people always have no work problems if they're upfront about it, but there is some discussion in the chapter about how the workplace and the employer's response can be helpful to helping people get treatment. Similar to friends too, by the way, they talk here about coworkers offering cover-ups, and certainly there can be a us versus them mentality, which is an enabling sort of response. If I cover for my coworker, then I may be thinking I'm helping him or her out. From a substance use perspective, my covering up for him or her actually allows them to continue their use. They do a nice discussion in the chapter that begins on page 206 about how does this model, since Johnson was talking really about alcohol, does the model apply to other drugs of abuse? And the quick thinking is that in general it probably does apply, although there's a recognition that when we're talking about the distinction between legal and illegal or licit and illicit substances, certainly it's complicated by the use of substances that are illegal. As we've talked about in previous modules, societal attitudes towards, quote, illegal or illicit substances are evolving and changing over time as well. So we have to be mindful of that. So take a look at the discussion about how it applies to the other drugs of abuse that again begins on page 206 and continues on to page I think 207 into 208 as well in the chapter. The quick thinking is that the model, the stages, the learning, seeking, harmful, and problematic stage are using to feel normal probably do apply. There's just complications because if a substance is illicit, then there's other risks that go along with continuing to use it that aren't necessarily faced by the person who's choosing or involved with the use of alcohol as his or her drug of choice. And then the chapter closes with a quick reference to adolescent substance use. The challenge that they talk about there, and it's a pretty short discussion, we'll look a little bit later in the course on some more information about adolescence as well. But one of the challenges they talk about here is that it can be challenging to determine when behavior changes are a result of substance use or a result of normal developmental changes, cognitive, emotional, etc. changes. And so, how do we discern what's, quote, part of normal development and what's part of substance-related problems? And they also talk about something that we actually run into quite a bit, sort of the not my kid approach that parents take. There's many parents who don't really want to know what's going on. They become protective of their kid. I would call that, willful ignorance. Some folks would call it enabling, but it's really hard for parents. Parents are very invested in their children. We want our children to be healthy. We want our children to be successful. And so it can be hard to open your eyes and recognize that your child is having a problem. And certainly, and that last bullet there is not any different for adolescents versus adults who are using, but certainly there's not typically an openness on the part of kids or adults to say, yeah, that's what's happening. And so they try to become sort of change their behavior, keep things hidden, keep things out of sight. The ideal strategy is to not be identified as having a problem here.